Okay, looks like we got pretty much everybody who registered. There might be one or two who kind of come in afterwards, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As always, I'll try to keep this as short and simple as possible and try not to go over an hour in total time. First of all, I want to thank everybody for their time today. I know these things can get kind of boring just sitting there listening to me speak and watching the slides go through one another. So I appreciate your time and thank you very much for being attentive. Today we're going to talk about service contracts. Now, over the years, DIPIT has covered this topic in a variety of different settings and given a whole bunch of information, some of it good, some of it bad, some of it useful, some of it not so much. Today probably won't be terribly much different from anything that anybody's ever heard before, but I'm going to attempt to address some of the more pressing questions that we either see on a regular basis or that we don't seem to be getting the message through as articulately as we would like. So if at any point in time during the broadcast you have a question, as usual, please feel free to, I'm going to turn my email off here. Please feel free to send me a question in the question box on the right-hand side of your control panel there, and I'll do my best to answer that question. That being said, let's go ahead and dive right on in. So on today's agenda is we're going to cover the following topics. First of all, why are we talking about service contracts in the first place? What's so special about them? Who's responsible for the service contracts? Who's responsible for finding out if they're available, talking to people? Who's responsible for signing them, all that fun stuff? What different types of contract types are there? We're going to talk about that. What rates or terms should be included in a service contract, and then how do we classify the revenue that we generate from those service contracts, and then we're going to answer some very specific questions. We only have about 4 or 5 of those. We're going to answer some very specific questions related to service contracts and hope that that clarifies any confusion that might exist out there. So why a service contract? Why is it so important? There's a lot of different reasons why. But these are what we consider to be the 3 most important reasons. Number one, it builds local participation in the transportation program. We tell folks all the time that we're more than just transportation operators or grant-making agencies. We need to be agents of independence and stewards of mobility, and that's kind of what we want to do. And we do that by fostering community relationships and partnerships with the various human service agencies and just agencies in general who are out there and in supporting the citizens of our community. By engaging in those agencies and talking about how the public transportation program can benefit their agency and the consumers of their agency, we do kind of build up those community relations and build those partnerships. And then it creates a local ownership and support of the program. It's not enough, unfortunately, just to be out there and let people know what you represent and what you support and how you can impact their community. We want the local agencies and the local community support system to be just as engaged and just as enthusiastic about public transportation as we are. So by going out and talking about how your service can impact the community, you're building that type of local ownership. It's very important. Very, very important, actually, in the sustainability of the program and in making sure that the image of the transportation program stays a positive one. Service contract revenue is the most flexible revenue component that you're going to be able to generate. It can be used to meet your local match requirement. It can be used for capital expenditures. It can be used for service expansion, et cetera, et cetera. There are very few constraints, if any, on how service contract revenue can be spent. It is especially important when, as we all know, we're facing a little bit of budget uncertainty for the coming fiscal year. We're not sure what's going to be approved or not approved. We're not sure if we're going to have an increase in funding or a decrease in funding. And if we do have a decrease, we don't even know how much. We may see a decrease we may see a static level in the overall funding appropriation, but we may see a decrease in the available percentage of reimbursement. So there's a lot of different things that are going to be happening on the horizon. We're just not sure where that puts us, and that makes all of our flexible revenue that much more important. It becomes a critical lifeline for our transportation program. So by generating service contract revenue that has the greatest degree of flexibility, we just kind of secure our position, our financial position, and we can better weather some of these uncertain storms. And then, of course, the coordination of resources is a pretty big component, and that just kind of stretches across all federal programs, not just 5311 and not just 5310. All of the participants in those programs have the requirement to maximize the available resources that are going into a community. And so by engaging in the discussion about service contracts and the discussion with human service agencies for how your system can benefit those agencies and benefit the community, you're meeting that requirement. So that's always an important one moving forward. So who's responsible for the service contract? Who develops it? Who implements it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the short answer is, I'm going to jump to the bottom and then work my way back up. The short answer is all stakeholders are really ultimately responsible. The human service agencies have a duty to the consumers that they provide services for to ensure that those consumers have access to transportation, have access to their services. And transportation is a key and critical component to improving that access. The providers themselves, the operators themselves, are definitely responsible because they are the frontline image of the public transportation program. And in most cases, your operators are not just providing the service, but they're actually collecting the revenue from those agreements. And so they have a fiduciary responsibility there to safeguard that revenue and then to apply it the way it's supposed to be applied. And then, of course, the grant recipients, they are ultimately responsible in this environment because they own the project assets. And any revenue generated from the use of those project assets has to be accounted for in a very specific fashion. And it's the grant recipients who are responsible for ensuring that the assets are used in an efficient manner and that the revenue is recorded appropriately and then used appropriately. So they definitely have a stake in this. And then the general public itself is definitely a stakeholder. This service is there to provide for them. And when we integrate public transportation with other social services, the community as a whole just kind of functions a little bit better. So the general public definitely has a stake in making sure that our transportation programs are aligned and benefiting our other social service programs. So in that sense, everybody's responsible. But the front line of overall responsibility lay with the grant recipients. And it just kind of filters downhill from there. So what types of contracts are we going to talk about today? And I want to make clear before we get any further that we're not going to talk about these in significant detail, and I'll explain a lot about that a little bit later. At the end of the day, these contracts are all generated at either the grant recipient level or the operator level, and so DIPIT's not going to tell you what you have to put in a contract. We're not going to tell you what type of contract you have to use. We're not going to tell you how much money you have to make on a contract. We're not going to tell you what level of service you have to provide on a contract. There are a handful of constraints. They're very, very limited. A handful of constraints that service contracts have to operate within. Other than that, it really is up to the parties involved in the agreement. DIPIT is just there to make sure that the use of the equipment maintains its openness to the general public and that the revenue generated from the service agreement is appropriately classified and used to benefit the transit program. Beyond that, it really is up to the parties who are the agencies and organizations who are party to the agreement. So we'll get into that a little bit later. So what types of contracts do we have? These are probably the most popular. I'm sure there's a lot more out there in the overall contracting world, but by and large, these are the types of contracts that we typically see. A gentleman's agreement, a basic type of a overall agreement, a flat fee agreement, cost reimbursement, and then fee per mile, fee per ride. Now the last three we kind of are going to talk about in one sitting because they're pretty much the same, just a couple of variables here and there. So your gentleman's agreement, this is an unofficial and unbinding agreement. There are no terms specified. Nobody can look up a document and say, well, this is how much service we're supposed to provide, or this is how much we're supposed to get paid for that service. It is just basically a phone call from one human service agency to a transit agency to say, hey, we got some people who need rides. We're willing to give you X amount of dollars per whatever for you to provide that service. Transit system agrees, and then bada boom, bada bing, the money just shows up one day. There's usually not any clear defined line of we're going to bill you this much, we're going to invoice you this much, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very, not in unethical terms, but it's a very behind closed doors type of an agreement. It's just money changing hands for no specific or delineated reason. Now, because of that, because there's no real way for us to track and be accountable in our world of transparency for where that revenue came from, we want to make sure that it's used to benefit the transit program. That being said, DIPIT has come up with the policy that says for these unofficial, unbinding gentlemen's agreements type revenue, you have to use that to lower your operating deficit. You can't use it as local match. Got to basically claim that as project income. So on line 402.06 of the uniform source of accounts that I sent out earlier, line 402.06 is the non-contract special transit special service fare revenue area, and you'll log that type of fare, you'll log that type of income revenue as project income, so that it lowers your deficit. It will not be used for local match. You'll also log all of it that you receive in the reporting period. So if you have a gentleman's handshake agreement for $1,500 per quarter to be paid to the transit program for services to whatever agency decides to pay it that way, you'll log the entire $1,500 as project income for that particular reporting period. I'm just using examples, not being specific in any way. Because those fares are not guaranteed on a contractual basis and no type of an agreement exists that specifies any kind of terms up to and including the amount of money you're supposed to collect, that's where you're going to put it. I want to make very clear that this is not the federal standard, this is the state standard. Now, the state can be more restrictive than the federal government. We just cannot be less restrictive than the federal government. And in this particular instance, we've taken the position of saying we want to make sure that all of the revenue generated from contract type services or from transit services are benefiting the transit program. And because we cannot keep track of these revenues via a contract or via an invoicing program, we're going to have you guys log them as project income to make sure that they're benefiting the system accordingly. Okay? Now we move on to a basic agreement. What is a basic agreement? A lot of times these are single-page agreements that just basically say, hey, we're going to provide transportation services in exchange for an amount of money. Now that amount of money can be a flat rate, it can be paid per quarter, it can be paid in advance, it can be paid per year, it can be reimbursed in any number of ways. There's a lot of variable revenue to take into consideration because you may not necessarily be certain of how much it's going to be. And the level of service is going to vary as well because it may depend on, again, it may be a flat fee, almost a donation of sorts. It may be based on the rider. It may be based on a mile. It may be based on a route. It may be based on a lot of different varieties. These are higher risk in the sense that because there aren't a lot of specifics, it may be difficult to pinpoint what type of service you actually provided to that particular, when you actually provided service to that particular agency. And also because there is no specific dollar figure in a lot of instances to be paid for up to a specific amount, there really isn't a lot of control for the agency paying the bill to say, well, you can't charge me more than X number of dollars per billing period or per whatever the period of the agreement may be. We typically see these contracts for smaller revenue amounts, a couple $100 a month maybe, that a local agency has to contribute toward transportation services for their agency. They would just as soon wrap that up in a contract with a public transit service provider. And the service provider isn't going to go into great detail about the level of service because it's such a small amount of demand and such a small amount of revenue. This basic type of a single-page agreement is usually the best option for them. So again, that's the type of thing that we would typically see in a basic agreement. Very few clauses, if any. It's usually very, very simple, few paragraphs, and that's it. A flat fee contract is similar to a basic contract, but the revenue itself is a static amount of revenue. That means that it's going to be a program-driven revenue. For example, a Title IIIB agreement that a public transit provider may have with a local senior agency. The Title IIIB dollar figure that the agency receives for transportation services is usually a known amount. And so in instances like that, that 3B recipient agency would simply hire out to the public transportation agency for the amount that they receive in 3B transportation funding, be that $100,000 a year, $5,000 a month, whatever that is. And their agreement will be structured in such a way as to say, you're going to provide services to our consumers at no charge to the consumer, but you will bill or invoice our senior agency on a monthly or quarterly basis, not to exceed $50,000 or $60,000 or $70,000 per year, whatever that may be. The level of service is going to vary because it is going to be rider-driven. And by rider-driven, I mean that the riders themselves, as they're scheduling service on their own behalf, are going to determine what level of service is going to be provided in any given time. So in 1 month, you may a public provider may provide 1,000 rides for that senior agency under that contract, and then the next month they may only provide 100. It's going to be entirely dependent on the demand placed on the agency on the provider by the riders. There are some protection clauses usually that are intended to protect the riders themselves. We see this type of a contract in a lot of 3B environments because they want to ensure that, number one, the seniors are going to get the services that they want and that they are entitled to, but also that the seniors are going to be protected from being charged a fare, et cetera, et cetera. And then on some instances, you'll see that the public transportation provider will put some clauses in there that says, hey, we'll be glad to provide this service, but we're not going to provide any kind of medical attention to your riders when they're on board the vehicle. Something like that. It's usually not very legally driven. It's not very clause heavy because, again, it's just a basic flat fee type of a contract that we're choosing to implement. This is, again, the most common environment for this is going to be the 3B environment. That's where we see this quite a bit. Another type of contract is cost reimbursement. This is where the transit provider is going to recover 100% of their fully allocated cost of service for whatever level of service that they happen to be providing. Usually it's a predetermined level, like you're gonna make a bus available, 16-passenger bus available at our location from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. and then again from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. And however much it costs your organization, the providing organization, to have that service made available to that agency during that specified time period is how much you'll invoice them for based on the terms that they outline. You're going to see in these types of agreements a very detailed explanation of how the provider agency arrived at the fully allocated cost. That's where you're going to see all of the associated direct and indirect expenses laid out and a detailed explanation of each cost laid out within the contract. That way the other party, the human service agency being served, has detailed information about exactly how much the service is going to cost them at any one point in time. There are usually significant clauses involved in this type of an arrangement because the providing agency, or excuse me, the purchasing agency wants to make certain that they are not paying for certain types of expenses, or they're not paying for certain types of services, that they're only paying for transportation services. They also want to make certain that the invoicing of those services are itemized in a very specific fashion. Again, I'm just using this as I'm using examples that we've seen here in DIPIT to make this explanation. This is not something that we are requiring, and this is not something we're telling you has to be included in this contract. These are just examples that we've seen throughout the years. But usually the purchasing agency wants to see the costs itemized in a very specific manner, and usually they compare those itemized invoices back to the original agreement to ensure that the costs that were identified in the agreement at the beginning phases are itemized and recovered accordingly on each individual invoice, and that there are no additional costs or escalators or anything like that. This is not quite as common as some of the other ones that we're going to talk about, but this is by far the most common recommendation that we make. We make certain, we being DIPIT, make certain that every one of our transportation providing agencies understands that in order to maximize your service contract revenue, in order to maximize your ability to gain service contracts, you have to understand exactly what your fully allocated costs are. We would much rather see agents, transportation providers go out and generate service contracts that recover 100% of their costs. This is probably one of the lesser used contracts for our providers, but it is the one that I think we have a tendency to pitch a little bit more when we talk about this issue. So that's cost reimbursement for you. And then fee per mile ride hour. This is where I think we see the most common use of service contracts. It's kind of a blend between that basic contract that we talked about a little bit earlier and then this fee per mile ride or hour. Now, you can have some contracts that specify each, per mile, per ride, per hour. Rare, but it does happen. I would say most of them are going to be based on ridership, that the purchasing agency will pay X number of dollars per ride provided, and then the providing agency has to invoice them with manifests that demonstrate these are the rides that are to be credited to or billed to your organization, et cetera, et cetera. In order to do that, in order to arrive at a fair amount, you have to understand what those fully allocated costs are, just like in the 100% cost reimbursement model. You have to understand how much it costs you to provide your service by mile, by hour, and by ride. We can talk about that at another session for how to actually identify your fully allocated costs, but it really is just all of your direct and indirect expenses divided by the number of miles you typically travel on an annual basis, the number of hours, and the number of rides. It's just really, it is more complicated than I'm making it out to be, but it is simple to understand in that respect. It is going to be variable revenue because in most instances these types of contracts are entirely rider driven. They are the origination and destination points of the trips being provided are going to be determined by the rider in most instances. In some instances they are the origination point or destination point may be the actual purchasing agency location. But I would say the majority of the instances it's going to be determined by the rider themselves. They're going to tell the providing agency where to pick them up, where to drop them off, when to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also see in this instance a lot of specified level of service where the vehicle needs to be available at a specific time of the day or specific days of the week. You'll see a lot of that in per hour type reimbursement agreements where a purchasing agency would like to make available a vehicle for their consumers during specific hours of the day. On a per mile, where providing agencies are reimbursed per mile, you'll see something where the purchasing agency wants to make a vehicle available on a specific day of the week to transport consumers from one general origination point to one general destination point, and in most cases back again. Dialysis is the most common use of that type of an agreement where we're going to have folks picked up at a common or picked up at various locations but dropped off at a common location. We see a lot of that. We also see the same for meal services for senior organizations. We have meal service every day from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And we want a vehicle to go pick up people in various locations before 11 a.m., bring them into the meal service, and then pick everybody up at the center after the meal service and deliver them back out to their places of origination. A lot of those types, the meal service types, are reimbursed on a per ride basis. So again, it's a mixed bag. Going to definitely have a variable revenue stream. You're not necessarily going to know from one reporting period to the next what the revenue is going to be from that particular contract, but it will have a set level of service that you're to provide for X number of vehicles or X number of hours or X number of days per week. This type of a contract is also up there among the most recommended from DIPIT because, again, we recognize that purchasing agencies are going to have different levels of expectation for service, and understanding what these fully allocated costs are and being able to craft agreements that are going to be reimbursed or paid for by mile, hour, or ride allow the greatest flexibility for the providing agency as well. So what goes in a service contract? What's supposed to be in there? We've talked about the different types in a very basic format. We've talked about the different types of what needs to go in there. Well, let me tell you, that is 100% a local decision. And by local decision, what I mean is those who are party to the agreement are the ones who determine how much information has to go into that contract. The only constraint when building a service contract is IDOT has basically said, hey, you cannot take a revenue service vehicle out of revenue service and make it exclusive to an individual agency smack dab in the middle of your operation. That the service, irrespective of what it is, still has to be open to the general public. Now, that's not to say that the agency itself may not fill that vehicle to capacity with demand, but at a minimum, it has to be open to the public so long as there's the capacity to accommodate a general public passenger. That's really the only constraint that we impose upon service contracts, making sure it's open to the general public. How much you charge, how you get reimbursed, how often you as providers bill purchasing agencies, all of that is up to it depends entirely on the comfort level of the parties to the agreement. How often are you comfortable with billing them? How often are they comfortable with having to write a check to you guys? Does your organization want to have their legal team review it or craft a contract? Does the purchasing organization need to have their legal team review it or draft the contract? All of that stuff needs to be negotiated ahead of time before you ever get to the point of actually putting something on paper. That way you understand exactly what the expectations are from both the purchasing and the providing organizations. And then the rates and terms really are going to be determined based on the common goals. You know, we each have a common goal of consumer mobility, and we as providers have a common goal of raising local revenue. As long as we understand their common goal or their goal of ensuring that their consumers have access to transportation services, and they understand our common goal of ensuring that the revenue that we're generating has that flexibility to meet our matching requirements. As long as we're all talking the same language and we all understand one another's perspective, there really isn't any one set formula for how to craft a contract, what it needs to contain or doesn't need to contain, how much to charge or not to charge, how often to bill or not to bill. All of that really, like I said, is going to depend entirely on the parties for that agreement. Again, with the understanding that ultimately it's the grant recipients who are responsible for the project equipment and project activities, and that ultimately it is IDOT who's going to kind of follow up with all that stuff. That's really what it boils down to. Okay, 100% local decision. So once we have the contract in place, and let me go back real quick and talk about the terms. A question came up that what are the thoughts on a human service agency wanting language in the contract that would not hold them, the human service agency, liable if a customer causes harm, damage to the vehicle persons or other persons while on board the vehicle? And the answer is that really is the comfort level. Again, going back to that second bullet point, it is the comfort level of the parties in the agreement. How comfortable is the providing agency for allowing the human service agency to indemnify themselves that way? How comfortable is the human service agency for taking on the responsibility for ensuring that they don't put passengers on board public vehicles who may be a danger to themselves or other passengers. This is not a situation, and I'm glad that you brought this up, this is not a situation where the transit agency needs to or should be assuming total responsibility for the care and behavior of a passenger who requires special care while they're on board the vehicle. It's up to the purchasing agency to understand what the needs of the passenger is or are, however grammatically that has to be said, what the needs of the passenger are, and to make sure that the passenger has everything that they require while they're in transit. Okay, we make it very clear from the administrative perspective that we do not expect our operators to become ad hoc doctors, ad hoc social workers, ad hoc caseworkers. We don't expect that of our drivers. We don't expect that of our transit operators. And so the human service agencies that you're working with need to understand and have similar expectations that, hey, while the passenger is on board the vehicle, our public transportation provider is not going to become an ad hoc doctor. They're not going to administer medications. They're not going to monitor an oxygen tank, on behalf of the passenger. If that's something that the passenger requires while they're on board the vehicle, then we, the care organization, need to make, not transit, care organization, purchasing agency, needs to make those types of arrangements and work those types of details out with the passenger, not us as the transit providing agency. So again, when we talk about language that holds or doesn't hold consumers or customers liable, whether or not that language is included in your agreement depends entirely on the comfort level of the parties in the agreement. Plain and simple. I wish I had a more concrete answer for you, but that is the reality of the situation. It depends on what everybody wants to see in that agreement. Okay? So now that we've got this agreement in place, what do we do with the money? and there's no easy way to do it, but it's not as difficult as it may seem. The first thing that we do is we look at the uniform source of accounts that's issued by the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level. I emailed a copy of that document to everybody along with the review materials here. That document identifies exactly what all the line items are on the revenue side and the expense side of our projects, and then gives some information and examples of what's supposed to go in each one of those line items. So based on how your how your contract or your agreement is structured, that's going to determine whether or not you classify it as a special transit fare, whether or not you classify it as a local cash donation, whether or not you classify it as a subsidy from another resource. I'm not going to waste your time going into each individual classification of revenue, but within that document that I mailed you is exactly that, the definition for each classification and how you're supposed to set that up. The difference between the two, or I shouldn't say between the two, the differences are the things to keep in mind. Do you have a contract, first and foremost? If you have a written agreement that says XYZ company is going to buy services from ABC company and this is how much we're going to pay them, then you can lump it as local match. If you don't, if you just have a gentleman's agreement and every month ABC company sends you a check, then you're going to have to use that as project income. That's the only constraint on that. Once you have your revenue in place, if you need to utilize it for, well, first of all, it has to be logged on your local service contract revenue account form. And I apologize, I forget the name. I should have brought that form with me. On your local service contract revenue form that's contained in the request for payment package, that's where you'll log all of the revenue you generate, whether you have to use it for local match that quarter or not, irrespective, it's going to go on that sheet. The revenue that you collect that you do have to use to meet your matching requirement for that period, if any, is going to be logged on your revenue sheet, the revenue sheet of your RFP, under the appropriate line item, whichever one it belongs in, and then in the local match category, or the local match column, local match column. That's why I say it's a lot less complicated than it seems. when you really get down to it. And as long as you follow the uniform source of accounts description in those revenue line items so that you're appropriately classifying the revenue into the appropriate line item, in almost all of them, with the exception of the 401 series, which is actual passenger or fares collected from passengers, you have the flexibility to use it as either local match or project income. That decision is entirely up to the grant recipient agency. Again, the only policy there is if there is no contract, you can only use it as project income. So a follow-up question came in and asked for examples of language regarding Human Service Agency either accepting or not accepting the risk associated with holding the provider liable. And the answer to the question there is, and I'm going to get to this in a second, and in fact, let me just put that off for a second. I'll deal with that here in one second. So again, follow the uniform source of accounts for the revenue classification, and as long as you have a contract, you're good to go. If you don't have a contract, make sure it's listed as project income. So let's talk about some questions. Question number 1, why does IDOT care so much about service contracts and how much money we make? Well, there's two ways to answer that. The first is a short answer. It is a flexible revenue source that can be used for expansion, local match requirements, capital improvements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As long as it is a transit-related expenditure, then you can use it pretty much any way you need to use it. And there goes my system. I knew it was going to happen. You can pretty much use it any way you need to use it. There's no, again, the sole constraint on that funding is that it be used for the transportation program. Other than that, like I said, expansion, match, capital improvement doesn't matter. The longer answer, a little bit more in-depth answer, is IDOT ultimately is responsible for the effective use of the federally funded project assets. The FTA is going to look to us and say, how are you using your buses? We can't just simply say, well, we gave them to the counties and we don't care after we gave them to the counties. They're still going to look to us and hold us responsible for what happens with those vehicles. In addition, we have the responsibility to ensure that every grant recipient agency and every pass-through operator has the managerial and financial capacity to operate the program or to implement the program. The service contracts and local revenue generated through the stuff that we're talking about here strengthens the financial position of that project for long-term sustainability, especially as we talked about in the beginning in this era where we're not 100% sure how our state funding is going to play out, whether we get more or less, whether we're reimbursed at the same amount or less amount. We're just not 100% certain. So in times of uncertainty like that, these local funds become that much more important. They become that much more critical to making sure that we have the ability to maintain operations even as our federal and state funding resources change. So let's keep that in mind. What if question number 2, what if the operator or client agency doesn't want to formalize agreements? There's not much we can do about that. We can't force somebody's hand to sign something that they don't want to sign, first of all. And if I could, that kind of leads back to, and hang on a second, I'll get back to that in a second. We don't have the ability or the authority to force someone to sign something that they don't want to sign. So we need to make sure that that's at the forefront. Secondly, we want to make sure that we understand what the objections may be if they don't want to sign an official agreement. Try to address those objections as they come. But nevertheless, whatever the comfort level may be, if neither agency is comfortable actually formalizing an agreement, as we've said a couple of times, just make sure that whatever revenue is being collected is classified as project income on the appropriate line item. That's really the best that we can offer. How do we know if the service being requested is charter, school bus, or service contract eligible? There's a couple ways. The first is, and I included along with the email today, a copy of the FY 2015 State Management Review Workbook. Now that is the workbook that we at IDOT are held to when the FTA comes out for their triennial reviews. We get those every 3 years, and within that book is every question that they ask and every federal resource or every federal citation source that they look at when they're asking these questions, what they compare our operation to. That's exactly what we do. We go by that set of documents and that set of citations or regulations when we ask questions of you. So I included that so that everybody has the overall oversight guidance document that comes from the FDA. 49 CFR Part 604 is the charter regulations. 605 is the school bus regulations. If you're concerned about it, the first question I would do, or the first thing I would do, is look up in the State Management Review Workbook and see what the exceptions are and see what types of service specifically qualifies as charter, specifically qualifies as school bus. Also, what I included this afternoon that isn't on this slide is a decision tree for charter service. It's a series of questions that you'll ask about the service you're being requested to provide, and whether or not you answer yes or no will determine whether or not it is charter service or eligible for public service. And then within that State Management Review Workbook is guidance on what you need to do if you determine that it is charter, but you still want to provide it. Same thing with school bus. If you determine that it is school bus eligible, but you still want to provide it. Now, why won't DIPA provide us with a contract template? This kind of goes back to the question that I was asked about providing some examples of language regarding the Human Service Agency's willingness to accept or decline associated risk. First is, DIPA doesn't mandate what terms must be included in the agreement. Every agency has their own preference, and every agency is different in that preference. By that term, every agreement is different. We're not 100% sure from one agency to the next what they're going to want to see or not see. Furthermore, we're not 100% sure with the same agency from one agreement to the next what they're going to want to see or not want to see. And so that's why we're talking about, that's why we talk about it, but we don't issue templates, and we don't tell you what needs to go into that. We go back to that comfort level issue. This is all about the comfort level of the parties to the agreement. And while DIPA is overall responsible for the oversight of the project activities, we are not a party to that agreement specifically. So we will not dictate what goes into a service contract. What I recommend, quite frankly, is reach out to peer agencies and ask them what they put in their service contracts. The reason that we don't share service contracts just out there and open to the general public is we don't own them. I don't have the authority or the ability to simply, and I realize they're public documents even as I'm saying this, I don't have the authority or the ability to disseminate a contract from Rides Mass Transit District or Piatran or Showbus. I don't own that contract. Yes, I have to review it, and yes, I have to make sure that it meets with certain state and federal guidelines, but I don't own the contract, so I don't have the ability to share that information. In that instance, I highly recommend communicating with your peer organizations and finding out what it is that they do. How comfortable are they with allowing human service agencies to defer liability for their consumers when they're on board the vehicle? That's something that really I'm not in a position to answer, so that's what I recommend. Next question, why do I care about service contracts when it's the operator's responsibility? Well, it's not the operator's responsibility. The operator is the implementer of a service contract, yes. They are the provider of the services under the terms of that contract, yes. But they are operating vehicles owned by the grant recipients. They are reimbursed by funding paid to the grant recipients. Grant recipients are the ones who own all of that function, i.e. the counties. They own the whole function. They're the ones that are responsible for how the revenue generated gets used in the transportation system. So by having an agreement with your operator that says my operator is going to go out and generate all the local match, okay, but that does not remove the county's responsibility for ensuring that the local match generated is used appropriately in accordance with state and federal guidelines, and it does not absolve them from their responsibility to make sure that the project equipment, the assets, are used for project services and activities. All of that eligibility therein still falls to the grant recipient to ensure that it's done in a compliant fashion, much the same way that IDOT still has the responsibility to make sure that our counties and our operators are operating their services within a compliant fashion. So that's the number one reason. Grant recipient still owns the process. So I kind of, we had a lot of questions, and really we kind of generated a lot of questions based entirely on previous conversations that we've had with grant recipients. So when I say that these were the only questions that we received, I don't want to diminish that we did get a lot of feedback from operators and grant recipients in the field. So I want to thank everybody for that feedback. These 5 questions were the best way to paraphrase what the questions were that we actually fielded. So I hope I kind of answered everybody's question in that sense. So the question came up just now, how can a document be a public document and I'm not allowed to share those? And I didn't say that I wasn't allowed to share them. I said I'm not comfortable with sharing them. I don't own the documents. They are public documents in the sense that they can be requested from the agency who signed the documents, but I don't have the ability to just disseminate them at will. That's not up to me to determine. So in answer to your question, they can be made public if you request them from the parties to the agreement. IDOT is not a party to that agreement, but that's neither here nor there. Again, the overall recommendation is, and if I could, I'm going to give this anecdote. Hopefully, this clears up our position even better. We have in our possession a drug and alcohol policy template, and I'm going to steal Jeff Waxman's thunder for a minute. Jeff Waxman has a very robust and comprehensive drug and alcohol policy. Contained within that drug and alcohol policy are two different sets of guidance. One is a zero tolerance guidance, the other is a return to duty guidance. The zero tolerance basically says that if you test positive on a drug or alcohol test, you're fired. The return to duty says if you test positive on a drug or alcohol test, here are the steps you have to go through in order to come back to work. Okay? You can choose one or the other. You can either be a zero tolerance organization or you can be a return to duty organization. You cannot be both. Now, Jeff does his diligence and passes out this template to everyone with instructions that they have to go through the template, read it page by page, word by word, and select which of those two types of organizations they want to be, zero tolerance or return to duty. I wish I had $1 for every agency that has returned that template without having made a choice between zero tolerance and return to duty. I use that anecdote to point out that it is all too common for grant recipients and operators to take the documents that IDOT gives them as samples and simply drop their names into appropriate places and then submit them as their own. That's what we don't want to have happen in the service contract world, because we don't want to paint the picture that, hey, this contract that we gave you as an example is what has to be used. I like to believe that we're pretty good about saying, here's something you must use for this particular process, or here's something you can use for this particular process. Unfortunately, the message doesn't always get as well received on the recipient and operator end, and there's the perception that everything that we give them must be used. So we stay away from providing service contract templates for that reason, because the terms of the agreement must be worked out between the parties in the agreement, not IDOT. So I hope that, maybe it sounds like a deflection, I hope not. That's the primary reason for why we don't actually issue templates in this particular instance, or examples in this particular instance. Your peer organizations are the better source for that. So, as I said, these 5 questions are what we felt were the best paraphrasing for the questions that we did receive. And we received about 18 or 20 of them. So thank you again for your participation. Also with that, I go back and say, if you have continued questions about service contracts, up to and including, hey, can you just put me in touch with a peer agency who's using a good basic contract or a good comprehensive contract, or run the gamut. And we see the gamut. We see single-page contracts all the way up to 22 or 23-page contracts. It runs the gamut. So even if it's just something as simple as, hey, can you put me in touch with a peer group who's using a good service contract and let me talk to them, we don't have a problem with that. If you have any other questions about service contracts, please feel free to reach out to me or reach out to your DIPIT project manager, and we'll be glad to either put you in touch with the right person or provide you with as much information as we possibly can. As always, and not as always, I did miss one or two. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and rebroadcast on a YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the day, no later than tomorrow afternoon. And there is a survey out there for today's webcast. I take those surveys very seriously. I appreciate the feedback that everybody has provided, and hope that you'll continue to do just that. Reach out to that survey and fill it out for me and let me know what I did good, what I did bad, or what you think I could do differently. With that in mind, we haven't gotten any additional questions. It's about 20 minutes after 2, so I kept everybody to less than an hour. I'm really proud of myself for that. Once again, any questions, you guys know how to reach out to me. I want to thank you for your time again today, and we'll see everybody next month on, I believe, March 14th. I don't have a calendar here in front of me, but that's okay. Sometime on March 14th, and then starting in June, we'll be broadcasting every third Thursday of the month unless we need to change it for scheduling purposes. So once again, thanks everyone for your time today, and we will see you next week.